Racist officer stops black man, then learns he's the head of internal affairs. It was just another regular morning for Officer Blake as he cruised down the quiet streets of the city, the early sunlight streaming through his windshield. The air was still cool, the kind of morning that made people want to stay bundled up in their homes a little longer. But for Blake, this was just the start of his shift, and he had a job to do. The city needed him, or so he believed. In the back of his mind, he thought about all the bad guys he was supposed to catch, the criminals lurking in the shadows, the ones that needed to be stopped before they caused harm. He wasn't thinking of anyone in particular, just that the job needed to be done. As he turned a corner, Blake's eyes scanned the road ahead. There wasn't much going on. Most of the shops in the area were still closed, and the few people out were either walking their dogs or heading to work. But then, just a block ahead, he saw him. A man walking alone, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets, head down, eyes looking straight ahead. The man was black, tall, with a strong, confident walk. Blake's instincts kicked in almost immediately. There was something about the way the man moved that didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the fact that he was walking so early in the morning, looking like he was headed somewhere far away. Or maybe it was the hoodie. Something about it felt off to Blake, as though it was a sign that the man was up to no good. It wasn't the first time Blake had made assumptions about someone based on how they looked, and today, his assumptions were in full gear. Without much thought, Blake flicked on his lights and signaled to the man to stop. The car screeched to a halt as Blake pulled up next to him. He immediately opened the door and stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a sharp sound. The man stopped walking and turned slowly to face Blake. He stood still, not moving a muscle, as Blake took a step forward. There was no sign of fear on his face, no rushing to make a getaway. It was as though he was waiting for this moment, his calm demeanor almost throwing Blake off. "Hey, you!" Blake called out, his voice harsh as he stood in front of the man. "What's your name?" The man didn't flinch. He simply raised his eyebrows and looked Blake in the eye. "What's this about, officer?" he asked calmly. Blake wasn't having any of it. The man's calmness only irritated him further. "I asked you a question." "Name." "Now," Blake demanded, trying to keep control of the situation. The man hesitated for just a second before speaking. "Charles Mitchell," he said simply, his voice deep but even. "Can I ask why you stopped me?" Blake's jaw tightened. He was ready for an answer, something to justify the action he had taken, something that would make this encounter feel necessary. "Just out for a walk, huh? You know it's a bit early for that, don't you?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back, eyes flicking to the side, and then returned his gaze to Blake. "Yes," he said slowly, "I'm on my way to work." "Is there a problem?" Blake wasn't going to let it go that easily. He had already made up his mind about the man before he even stepped out of the car, and now he needed to dig deeper. "I'm just asking questions, and you're not giving me enough answers," Blake replied, a sharp edge to his voice. "You seem a little too calm, like you don't mind being stopped. You got anything to hide?" Charles's face remained neutral, but Blake could see the tension in his shoulders. There was no panic, no nervous glances. Just calm and collected. It threw Blake off even more. He wasn't used to this. He expected the usual response, a bit of stammering, maybe some nervous laughter, a quick attempt to justify where someone was going or why they were out early. But Charles wasn't playing that game. He just stood there, quiet and firm, looking back at Blake like he wasn't the least bit fazed. Blake took a deep breath, trying to stay in control. He glanced up and down the street, making sure no one else was watching. "Let me see your ID," he demanded. Charles's expression didn't change. "You can," he said calmly, "but I think we both know this is unnecessary. You stopped me because of what I look like, not because I've done anything wrong." There was no anger in his voice, just a statement of fact. Blake frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Charles's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a stillness between them. Blake was caught off guard. It wasn't often that someone dared to call him out like this. Usually, people just gave in to whatever demands he made. But Charles wasn't like the others. "I'm just a man walking down the street," Charles said. "I didn't break any laws, I didn't give you any reason to stop me. And yet, here we are." Blake stood there for a moment, staring at Charles. The silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Blake's hand rested on his belt, just above his gun. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had already made the decision to stop the man, and now that he was face to face with him, he wasn't sure how to get out of this situation. The feeling of being in control was slipping away from him. "Let me see your ID," Blake repeated, his voice a little more forceful now. Charles sighed but didn't argue. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. Blake took it, running it through the system on his radio, and as the information popped up, he looked down at the name. The shock that followed was immediate. Charles Mitchell. Blake stared at the screen for a moment, his mind racing. He knew that name. He knew it well. Charles Mitchell wasn't just any man off the street. He was the head of internal affairs at the police department. The very department Blake worked for. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any random stop. Blake had unknowingly stopped one of the most powerful men in the department. The tension in the air was palpable. Officer Blake stood frozen, staring at the ID in his hand, his heart beating faster than he had expected. Charles Mitchell. It wasn't just the name that made Blake's stomach turn, it was the realization that he had just stopped someone who held a position of immense power in the very department he worked for. Charles wasn't just some random civilian. He was the head of internal affairs, the person who reviewed complaints against officers, investigated misconduct, and ensured that the department upheld its integrity. The weight of the mistake Blake had made was slowly sinking in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening. Charles stood still, his arms relaxed at his sides, and Blake felt the pressure of the situation building. He wasn't sure how to respond, and he definitely didn't know how to get out of this. What had started as a routine stop had suddenly turned into something far more complicated. Blake's mind raced. He had been taught to assume the worst in situations like this. It was ingrained in him to act with suspicion, to question anyone who seemed out of place. But now, looking at the man in front of him, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a grave mistake. It wasn't just that he had stopped the wrong person, it was that he had done it for all the wrong reasons. Charles broke the silence first. "I know what you're thinking, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're wondering if I'm going to make this difficult for you." Blake blinked, caught off guard by the man's ability to read the situation so easily. I didn't know who you were," Blake stammered, trying to explain himself. "I just thought, well, I thought you looked suspicious. And it's my job to investigate." His voice trailed off, as though the words didn't feel as convincing now that he was face to face with the consequences. Charles shook his head slightly, but there was no anger in his expression, only a quiet disappointment. "You thought I looked suspicious," he repeated. "Is that why you stopped me?" "Because I'm walking alone on the street at this hour." Blake didn't have an answer. He felt the weight of the question pressing down on him. It was a question he hadn't asked himself, and now that it was in front of him, he didn't know how to respond. His actions had been driven by assumptions, by ingrained biases that he had never questioned before. He had seen a black man walking alone, and that was enough to raise red flags in his mind. He hadn't stopped to think about why or how he had come to that conclusion. Charles continued, his tone still calm but filled with an unmistakable seriousness. "You know, officer, I'm not angry with you. I'm disappointed, but I'm not angry. You're not the first person to stop me like this, and sadly, you won't be the last. But the real question is, how many other people have you treated this way without even knowing their story? Blake swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had never thought about it that way. In his mind, he had done his job, followed protocol, and treated everyone the same. But now, standing in front of Charles Mitchell, he realized that the way he had been trained to approach situations wasn't always the right way. His assumptions had been clouding his judgment, and they had led him to make a snap decision about someone who didn't deserve to be judged based on how he looked. I didn't mean to offend you, Blake said, his voice quieter now. He wanted to apologize, but the words didn't seem like enough. I just didn't know who you were. If I had known, I would've. I don't know what I would have done. But I didn't mean any harm. Charles nodded slowly, his expression softening just a bit. I know you didn't mean harm. But the thing is, officer, you didn't take a moment to think about it. You didn't pause to consider the possibility that I'm just a regular person. You didn't think about what I might be going through or why I'm out here. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but Charles raised his hand to stop him. I'm not blaming you, he said. What I'm saying is that this happens every day. People get stopped because of how they look, because of their skin color, their clothing, or their neighborhood. And it's not just me, it happens to so many others, people who don't have the same privilege that others do. People who don't have the power to make sure their story gets told, to make sure they're treated fairly. The words hit Blake harder than he expected. He had never really considered how his actions might affect someone else, especially not in this way. He had always been focused on doing his job, on making sure he followed the rules and regulations. But now, standing here with Charles, he understood that the rules weren't enough. There were things that needed to be addressed beneath the surface, things that couldn't be fixed by simply following protocol. I never thought about it like that, Blake admitted, his voice almost a whisper. I was just doing my job. I didn't see it the way you do. I thought you were a threat. I thought you were doing something wrong. Charles exhaled slowly, his face softening. I know. And that's the problem. We're taught to think that way, to be suspicious of people who look different. We're taught to assume that people of color are dangerous or doing something wrong. But it's not true. We're not all the same. We all have our own stories, our own lives. Blake stood there, his mind reeling. He had heard about racism before, had read about it in the news, and had even seen it in his own community. But he had never truly understood it, not like this. Not until now, standing in front of a man who had every right to be angry, but wasn't. A man who had every right to call him out, but instead was offering him a lesson. Charles looked at him one last time before he turned to walk away. I'm going to let this go, officer, he said, his voice steady. But don't think this is over. You need to think about what happened here today. And next time, maybe you'll stop and think before you make assumptions about someone. Blake nodded, too stunned to speak. He watched Charles walk down the street, his footsteps steady and sure. Blake stood there for a long moment, the weight of the encounter settling in. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he would never look at things the same way again. The moments after Charles Mitchell walked away were like a heavy silence that fell over Officer Blake. His hands were still slightly shaking as he stood there, his thoughts swirling. Charles, the man he had just stopped, wasn't just anyone. He was someone who had the power to change things, someone who could make sure that mistakes like this didn't go unnoticed. And Blake knew that he had made one of the worst mistakes possible, not just as a cop, but as a human being. Blake stood by his patrol car for a few more minutes, staring down at the ground, thinking about everything Charles had said. It wasn't just the words that hit him, it was the tone, the calm authority in Charles's voice. He had every right to be angry, to raise his voice, to demand apologies and accountability. But instead, Charles had taken the time to speak with him, to make him understand, without ever losing his cool. Blake realized that Charles wasn't just some man on the street, he was the very person who held the department accountable, and he was also a person who had lived through experiences that Blake had never truly understood until now. Blake got back in his car and closed the door behind him. He had a duty to finish his shift, to patrol the streets, and to keep the community safe. But in that moment, Blake couldn't help but feel like he had just failed at the most important part of his job. He hadn't been able to see past his own biases. He had been taught to expect the worst from people, especially those who didn't look like him. He had assumed that Charles was a threat simply because of his appearance, and he hadn't stopped to consider the possibility that Charles was just a man walking to work, trying to get by like anyone else. His radio crackled to life, snapping Blake out of his thoughts. A call came through, a routine traffic stop on the other side of the city. He could hear the dispatcher's voice in his ear, but it felt distant, almost irrelevant. Blake glanced at the screen, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept returning to the conversation he'd just had. He knew he needed to finish his shift, but the events with Charles had left him feeling empty. His job had never felt so uncertain. Charles's words echoed in Blake's head, "How many other people have you treated this way without even knowing their story?" Blake didn't know the answer. The truth was, he had no idea how many people he had judged based on their appearance. In his years of service, he had stopped countless individuals, all for the same reasons: instinct, assumptions, and biases. He had convinced himself that he was doing his duty, that he was keeping the streets safe, but now he was starting to question whether any of those stops were justified. How many innocent people had he hurt without even realizing it? Blake's grip tightened around the steering wheel. He wasn't proud of what had just happened, and the shame of his actions weighed heavily on him. But in some strange way, he was also grateful. Grateful that Charles had been there to teach him a lesson. Grateful that someone had finally opened his eyes to the fact that his perspective had been narrow, clouded by his own upbringing and the biases that were part of the system he worked in. The rest of his shift passed in a blur, the minutes dragging by as Blake went through the motions. He didn't pull over anyone else that day. He didn't have the energy to engage in the same old routine of suspicion and judgment. Instead, he focused on simply driving, trying to clear his mind. But it wasn't that easy. Every time he turned the wheel, every time his thoughts wandered, he found himself replaying the moment he had confronted Charles. He kept seeing the calmness in the man's eyes, the way he had spoken without anger, without bitterness. Charles had shown Blake a level of patience and understanding that Blake didn't deserve. And it made him uncomfortable. As his shift came to an end, Blake knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't just go home and forget about what had happened. He had to do something. He had to make it right. He couldn't let this be another day where he learned nothing, where he continued to act out of assumptions and biases. He made a decision then. He would go to the precinct and request a meeting with his supervisor. He knew he had to take responsibility for what he had done. He couldn't pretend like everything was fine. He couldn't just say sorry and move on. This wasn't something that could be brushed aside. He had to confront the truth. He had to face the reality of his actions. The drive to the precinct felt longer than usual. Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a storm. He wasn't sure how his supervisor would react. He wasn't even sure what he would say. But he knew that if he didn't do this, he would never be able to move forward. His conscience would eat him alive, and the lessons that Charles had tried to teach him would be lost. When Blake arrived at the precinct, he took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy. He had no idea what the consequences might be. But the one thing he did know was that he couldn't keep pretending. He had to change. As he walked into the building, he felt the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he was ready to face it. He was ready to own up to the mistakes he had made, and he was determined to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. Blake knocked on his supervisor's office door and waited. When the door opened, he stepped inside. His supervisor looked up at him with a raised eyebrow, as if surprised to see him. "Officer Blake," the supervisor said, "what's going on? You look troubled." Blake hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I made a mistake today," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I stopped someone I shouldn't have. And I need to take responsibility for it." His supervisor didn't say anything right away, but there was a moment of understanding in his eyes. "What happened?" Blake took a deep breath and told his supervisor everything. He explained the situation with Charles, how he had stopped him without cause, how he had made assumptions based on nothing but the man's appearance. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply told the truth. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence. Blake didn't know what his supervisor was thinking. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of what would happen next. Finally, the supervisor spoke. "Blake, I'm glad you're owning up to it. This isn't easy. But you need to understand that this kind of thing has been happening for far too long. It's part of the system, and it's something we all need to address. But you've taken the first step. And that's what matters." Blake nodded, grateful for the support but knowing that the road ahead would be long. He wasn't sure where this would all lead, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to make the same mistake again. Blake sat in his supervisor's office for what felt like hours, the weight of his actions heavy on his chest. The conversation he had just had with his supervisor had not been easy, but it was a beginning. A start to something new. It wasn't going to be an overnight change, Blake knew that, but this was the moment where he could either choose to learn from his mistake or ignore it and let it slide. And for the first time in his career, Blake understood that it was up to him to decide. He left the precinct with his mind still racing. The words from his supervisor had been supportive, but they didn't make the situation any less difficult. As Blake drove home, he kept thinking about what had happened that day, the way Charles had so calmly pointed out his bias, the way he had remained collected even though he had every right to be furious. Blake had never experienced anything like it before. He had been used to people fighting back when they felt unfairly treated, and for a moment, he had braced himself for an argument, for anger, for anything but what he had gotten. Charles hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even shown the slightest bit of aggression. Instead, he had spoken with quiet authority, a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength was the ability to stay calm in the face of injustice. By the time Blake pulled into his driveway, it was dark, the cool night air wrapping around him as he stepped out of his car. But even though the night was quiet, his thoughts wouldn't let him rest. He couldn't shake the image of Charles walking away from the stop. The calmness in his stride, the lack of fear, the dignity with which he carried himself, Blake could see it all so clearly in his mind. He had made a mistake, but Charles had chosen to show him a different way, one that he never could have imagined. Blake went inside, still unable to forget what had happened. As he sat down at his kitchen table, he pulled out his notebook and started jotting down his thoughts. He needed to process everything, to understand it better, to figure out what had gone wrong and how he could do better. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept returning to Charles, to the lessons he had unknowingly taught him. The next morning, Blake went back to the precinct early, determined to make sure he didn't just let the day's events slip by. He knew he had to do more than just say sorry. He had to put in the work, show that he was willing to learn and change. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could make sure it didn't happen again. When he walked into the precinct, his supervisor was there, already getting ready for the day's tasks. Blake hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and approached him. "I'd like to do more," Blake said, his voice steady. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. I want to be better." His supervisor looked up from his desk, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm glad to hear that. This isn't just about you, Blake. It's about all of us. This department, the whole system. There's a lot that needs to change. But you're right. It starts with you. And it starts with taking responsibility." Blake nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in his gut. He had a long way to go, but he knew that this was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and move on. He needed to challenge his own biases, to look at the way he had been trained and ask himself whether it was truly the right way to approach every situation. The days that followed were a whirlwind of self-reflection for Blake. He went through his training manuals, rereading the lessons that had been drilled into him over the years. He asked questions he had never thought to ask before. What did the department actually teach about bias? What did it really say about how to treat people equally? The answers weren't easy to find, and Blake began to realize that the training wasn't enough. The system, as it was, had deep flaws. And as much as he wanted to believe that he was doing the right thing by following orders, he now saw how those very orders had shaped his views in ways he hadn't fully understood. One morning, Blake decided to take a different route to work. He had been passing the same old places for years, never really noticing the small things that made each part of the city unique. But today, he wanted to see it with fresh eyes. He drove down streets he had never taken before, past old buildings and through neighborhoods where he had never stopped. As he drove, he began to realize something that had always been right in front of him: the people in those neighborhoods were just like him. They had jobs, families, friends. They had lives filled with struggles, joys, and everything in between. They weren't others to be watched or suspected, they were just people. By the time he arrived at the precinct, Blake had a clearer sense of what he needed to do. He couldn't change the whole department overnight, but he could start by making small changes in the way he interacted with people. He could challenge his own assumptions, one interaction at a time. He could listen more and judge less. He could treat people with the same respect he would want for himself. Later that day, Blake met with Charles again, this time under different circumstances. He didn't stop him on the street. This time, they met in the precinct, where Blake had requested a meeting. Charles walked in, his usual calm and steady presence filling the room. Blake didn't know what to expect, but he knew this time was different. He wasn't facing Charles as someone who had just made a mistake. He was facing him as someone who wanted to learn. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Blake began. "And I want to say thank you. For not reacting the way I thought you would. For showing me a different way. I've realized that I've been seeing things wrong for a long time. I've been trained to think a certain way, but that's not enough anymore." Charles listened, his eyes never leaving Blake's. "It's not easy to admit when we've made mistakes," he said. "But it's the first step. I'm glad you're willing to do the work." Blake nodded. "I don't know where this is going, but I want to try. I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing from now on." Charles smiled, just a little. "That's all anyone can do. Just keep trying. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn." As Blake left the meeting, he felt a sense of relief he hadn't expected. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, and there would be times when he would have to check his biases and assumptions all over again. But for the first time in a long time, Blake felt like he was on the right path. The next morning, as Blake stood on the street once more, he didn't see the world the same way. He didn't see people as potential threats, as suspects, as problems to be dealt with. He saw them as individuals, with their own stories, their own lives. And as he moved forward, Blake knew that the lessons he had learned from that fateful stop would stay with him forever, guiding him toward a future where he could make a real difference both as a police officer and as a person. The days after the meeting with Charles Mitchell felt different for Blake. Each morning, as he put on his uniform and prepared for his shift, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He had made a promise to himself to learn, to grow, and to never let the biases that had been ingrained in him shape his actions again. It wasn't going to be easy, but Blake was determined to make the change. He found himself thinking back to the lessons Charles had unknowingly taught him, the way Charles had calmly handled the situation when Blake had expected anger, the way he had turned the moment into an opportunity for learning rather than confrontation. Blake realized that in many ways, he had been blind to his own assumptions, caught in the belief that his training had prepared him for everything. But his training had missed something important: the ability to see people as individuals, not as stereotypes or threats. Blake had been trained to follow orders, to respond quickly, to make snap judgments. But what Charles had shown him was that sometimes the most important thing was to take a step back, to listen, and to understand the bigger picture. It was a lesson that Blake would carry with him from that day forward, not just in his work, but in his life. On his next shift, Blake was out patrolling the same streets where he had stopped Charles weeks earlier. The air was still and quiet, the sound of his patrol car humming as he drove through the familiar neighborhoods. But this time, Blake wasn't just looking for suspicious activity or criminal behavior. He was looking for the people he passed, noticing the small things: the tired mother walking with her child, the elderly man sitting on his porch, the group of teenagers laughing together. They were all just people, going about their lives, doing the best they could in a world that often judged them before they had the chance to show who they really were. It wasn't long before Blake found himself pulling over a car. He had seen the driver run a red light, and in the past, he might have approached the situation with the usual suspicion. But today, as he walked up to the car, he took a deep breath and reminded himself to approach the situation with a fresh perspective. The driver, a middle-aged white man, rolled down his window, looking up at Blake with a nervous expression. Blake could see the tension in the man's face, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Blake didn't jump to conclusions. He didn't assume anything about the man. He just asked the questions he needed to ask. "Good afternoon, sir," Blake said, his tone calm and polite. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" The man looked down, fumbling for his registration and driver's license. "I'm sorry, officer. I ran the red light. I wasn't paying attention." Blake nodded, glancing down at the paperwork. "It happens. Just make sure to pay attention next time. We don't want anyone getting hurt." The man nodded, clearly relieved. Blake handed back the papers, and as he walked back to his patrol car, he realized something. He hadn't been on edge, hadn't felt the need to assume the worst. He had simply done his job fairly, without bias, and with respect. It wasn't about whether the man was guilty or innocent. It was about how he treated him in the process. As Blake drove off, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a huge victory. It wasn't going to change the world overnight. But it was a step in the right direction, a sign that he was becoming the kind of officer he had always hoped to be. The days turned into weeks, and Blake found himself continuing down the path of self-reflection. He spent more time listening to people, paying attention to their stories, and asking questions instead of making assumptions. He still made mistakes, of course. No one could change overnight, especially not after years of conditioning. But each day, Blake was becoming more aware of his own biases and doing his best to fight them. One afternoon, as Blake was leaving the precinct after his shift, he saw Charles Mitchell again. This time, the two men didn't meet in a tense, confrontational moment. Instead, they stood on the sidewalk, a brief exchange of words marking their encounter. Blake walked over to Charles, who was standing near his car, checking something on his phone. Charles looked up and smiled slightly when he saw Blake approaching. "Hey, Charles," Blake said, his voice steady but respectful. "I just wanted to thank you again." Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. "Thank me for what?" Blake smiled awkwardly, but there was sincerity in his expression. "For making me see things differently. I've been thinking a lot about that day. About how I stopped you, about everything you said. I just want you to know that I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to learn." Charles's smile widened, but he didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he just nodded. "That's all we can do, Blake. Learn, grow, and keep doing better. That's the only way forward." Blake nodded in agreement. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward. He wasn't going to be able to fix everything at once, but at least he was trying. A few weeks later, Blake received a report from his supervisor. It was a routine review of his performance, but there was a note at the bottom that caught his eye. It mentioned his improved interactions with civilians, how he had started taking more time to listen and engage with people instead of making quick judgments. Blake felt a sense of pride reading the words, even though he knew it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the work he was doing to change. The change wasn't just internal. It had started to affect his relationship with his colleagues as well. Some of them had noticed the shift in his behavior, and although Blake didn't seek praise, there was a quiet respect that began to grow among them. They could see that he was different, more thoughtful, more reflective. And for the first time in his career, Blake felt like he was actually making a difference. One evening, as Blake sat in his patrol car, reflecting on everything that had happened since that fateful encounter with Charles Mitchell, he realized something important: true change wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about the small, everyday choices: the way he approached people, the way he saw the world, the way he treated those he encountered. Blake knew that the road ahead would be long. He would continue to face challenges, to question his assumptions, to make mistakes. But for the first time, he felt ready to walk that road with a sense of purpose and integrity, knowing that he had learned one of the most valuable lessons of all: that everyone, no matter their race, background, or appearance, deserved to be treated with fairness and respect. And as he drove into the night, with the city lights shining ahead of him, Blake knew that he was on the right path.